Hey, how is your relationship going? Do you have really good boundaries in your relationship? Well, that's what we're going to talk about today. What are boundaries? Why do we need boundaries? And some basic structure or idea around what are boundaries and how they work. So if you're looking for some clinical advice about your relationship, and particularly about learning about good boundaries in your relationship, check us out. Hey, hi, I'm Brett Williams, licensed psychotherapist, and I'm building a wall. A wall is another great word for boundaries. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to get some clinical advice about how to create and what are good boundaries for your relationship. I'd like to start off by just talking a little bit about boundaries, what they are. Boundaries, the easiest way to think about boundaries are their rules. They're basic, guides of how we operate, how we live our lives. And the interesting thing about boundaries is that they're everywhere. Boundaries exist in every single part of our lives. There's boundaries and rules about how you drive, how you walk. There's boundaries and rules about how you act in public, how you act at work. I bet there's a lot of boundaries and rules about how you act at work, what you can wear, what you can't wear, what time you have to show up, and what time you get to leave. There's just a ton of boundaries in every part of our life. In fact, you can even think of the laws of physics as being boundaries that we all have to operate by. If I jump off a building and violate those laws of physics, there's going to be some negative consequences to that. So there's boundaries in everything. There's rules, there's basic structure in everything that we do, except one area of our life. One of our area of our life, we tend to think that boundaries shouldn't exist or they kind of don't exist. And where is that? That is in our relationships. That is so weird to me, but it's this kind of unconscious thing that all of us do. We think if we have a good relationship, then we don't need boundaries with one another. And somehow boundaries in a relationship is an indication that there's something wrong with your relationship. But I'm going to suggest that that's actually weird. That's actually wrong, because boundaries exist everywhere in the universe. Why wouldn't they exist in our relationships as well? Why wouldn't they be a normal and healthy part of our lives with our partners? They definitely were when we were dating. Think about it. When you were dating, you went out with somebody and they were an hour late. They were 2 hours late. How did you respond to that? Did you blow it off? If you did, you probably had poor boundaries, because most of us would have said, hey, that's kind of uncool. You just kind of left me hanging here. Or if, somebody came on a date and they were acting inappropriate, maybe they were drunk or intoxicated. Again, in our dating world, we'd probably look at that and go, okay, this guy's gone, or this gal's gone, depending on how they were. So having boundaries in our relationships isn't abnormal. It isn't unusual. We have boundaries with our children. How people act around the house is totally regulated. Certain behaviors are just not tolerated. Hitting other people, maybe cussing in your home, being defiant, arguing, not following the basic rules in terms of going to bed, things like that. All of those are a normal part of any family life. And if you don't have good boundaries in your family life, what happens? You got chaos. The family just kind of falls apart. Kids are doing whatever they want to do, and you're running around screaming and yelling. So boundaries are a really healthy and normal part of every relationship and every part of our life. So what are your boundaries in your marriage? Do you have boundaries in your marriage? Because interestingly enough, most people are, like I said before, they're kind of recalcitrant. They're hesitant. They're shy about keeping boundaries in their relationships, as if something is wrong to have boundaries in a relationship. I don't think that's true at all. Now, the population, the people that I deal with, a lot of times are dealing with heavy trauma. Somebody's been betrayed. Someone's cheated. Someone's really violated like the ultimate boundaries of a relationship. And now it's thrown the relationship in total chaos. And at that point, it's really easy for people to begin to understand, oh yeah, I need good boundaries. But we don't know how to set them. We don't know what they look like. We don't know how they work. And again, a lot of times, even after affairs or betrayals or whatever has gone on significantly to fracture a relationship, couples are still reluctant to set boundaries, to have limits and basic rules. So let's talk about what those boundaries should look like in our relationships, and maybe in subsequent sessions and video chats, we'll talk more detail about setting boundaries and setting something that's really, really important. Part of the whole boundary is consequences. And that's probably where we struggle the most. But the bottom line is you can't have boundaries in a relationship. You don't have boundaries in your relationships if you don't have consequences. Consequences are essential part of any boundary. So maybe that's one of the keys we can start talking about as we start to understand boundaries. Boundaries, in the most basic way, think of them as walls. They're limits, they're lines that we cannot cross. I oftentimes think of boundaries as rules that we have. And the number one reason that we have rules in our relationships or anywhere in our life is to keep people safe. You know, if I'm driving on the highway and there are no rules to the road, then driving on the highway or driving anywhere is going to be super dangerous. But because we have really clear boundaries and we have really clear consequences to those boundaries, my driving on the highway is safe because those boundaries create rules, they create structure. That structure keeps everybody in a good place. Have you ever heard that phrase, good fences make good neighbors? Well, again, it's the same kind of idea. That if I have really clear boundaries with my neighbor, they know, where they live and what their property line is. I know where I live and I know what my property line is. Then it helps us then begin to interact with each other because we're working with a common knowledge and a common understanding. Well, the same thing, think about it. The same thing has to happen in your relationship. You guys have to have good boundaries with each other because it just creates a good understanding. I certainly don't want to step on landmines in my life. I don't want to step on something and then have my spouse explode. One, because I don't like the flack that comes out of that explosion. But two, I don't like to hurt my partner either. So knowing what her boundaries are is really helpful for me. It's not a restriction. It's not a limitation. It's not a negative. It's super positive for me because now I have less explosions in my life, less explosions from my partner because I know what her boundaries are. I know, what I can do, what I can't do, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable. So we often, I guess one of the reasons why we think of boundaries as negative is we think of them as punitive because they have consequences. But everything in life has consequences. Again, I jump off a building, I'm going to break my leg, minimum. I may even die. Every action I take has consequences to it. Every action. If I want to acknowledge it or not, it has consequences. And even in your relationship, if I violate one of your boundaries, there may not be an official consequence to it, but there's going to be consequences. Loss of trust, loss of closeness, loss of intimacy, a distance, a disconnect. There's always consequences to everything that we do. So boundaries should be super normal for us because they keep us safe. And they're great. They're great to have in terms of creating structure and creating stability in any relationship. Now, again, I think where we get into trouble, where we get shy, is in the whole idea of consequences. Because I think for most of us, and you're probably thinking this right now in your own head, is we think of consequences as like parental. We have consequences for our kids. And none of us want to be parental with our partners. And so we have consequences in our parenting, but we certainly don't want to have any kind of consequences in our marriage because we don't want to be our partner's parent. And I think that's absolutely true. I think it's true that we don't want to be parental, but I don't think it's true that that's what consequences represent. Consequences, for me, basically represent consequences. They're the result of some action that I take. Every action I take has an impact. It creates some kind of effect in the world. And the consequences that you're creating in your marriage are basically reactions to certain behaviors. Now, again, I think because we don't have good boundaries and we don't have good consequences, what ends up happening in most relationships is that there's only one consequence. There's this extreme consequence. And that's where it comes down to divorce. You violate my boundaries enough time and I just get frustrated and I go, I'm out of here. And again, I think that's not appropriate. I don't think that's useful. I think there needs to be lots of little consequences. And those little consequences help me avoid this big cliff and falling off the big cliff. So let me give you some simple examples of what consequences and boundaries and all that kind of stuff look like in a healthy marriage. With my wife, she has what's known as dysphonia. Maybe she wouldn't admit that, but it's kind of there. And what that means is that her nervous system is wired, and it even showed up in her 23andMe DNA test, so I know it's neurological. But her nervous system is wired in such a way that she's ultra sensitive to sound, and particularly sounds of people chewing and crunching and making all kinds of noise. So a really minor kind of rule and consequence in our household is that eating chips around my wife is not a good idea. And oftentimes, when I'm eating chips, she'll get up and she'll walk out of the room. That's a boundary and a consequence. Now, we've been married for almost coming up on 35 years, so we don't need to review the boundaries and consequences. We know them. And so when I violate that boundary and I start munching, she gets up and she leaves the room. And I know what that means. I know what that's all about. There doesn't have to be a long discussion about it. And typically what I do is I'll take the chips and put them back. Hey, honey, I'm done eating. Sorry. Because I don't want to lose her company. But that's what happens is I lose her company when I'm annoying her with my eating chips. So there's 1,000 little things like that all of us have in our relationships. Do you pay attention to them? Do you call them out? Do you know them between each other? A classic example is like electronics. Do you guys bring electronics to bed? Are you on your phone, doing social media chats or whatever? And then watch what your spouse does. Is your spouse annoyed, irritated, frustrated? If they are, it's probably because they had a boundary about electronics in bed. And maybe they've told you about it, or maybe they haven't. And clearly you're now violating their boundary, and that's why they're pulling away and distancing themselves, because that's the consequence for violating the boundary. So we need to talk more about good boundaries for you, but that's the beginning thought for you today, is to think about boundaries. And I want you to think, for a homework assignment, I want you to think about, what are your boundaries? We think, the ultimate boundary is don't cheat. Well, that's a good boundary. That's a really good boundary. But is that the only boundary? And really, is that even a good idea, to just have this one really extreme boundary and consequence? Or is it more appropriate to have lots of different little boundaries that all help keep you safe in your relationship and keep the relationship going? So homework assignment for you is, I want you to think about boundaries. And if you come up with a ton of resistance, even doing the homework about thinking about boundaries, I want you to think about that. Because again, that goes back to our violating the rule. Boundaries live everywhere in the world except in our relationships. So just pay attention. Think about what I'm talking about with you today, and see if you can recognize, what are some of the boundaries. If you can, the next part of your homework would be, write them down. What are the things, what are the do's and don'ts in your relationship with your spouse or your partner? What are the things that you like? What are the things you don't like? What are the things you want? Because we can have good boundaries. And what are the things you don't want? And maybe what are the consequences if those things you don't want get violated? So start looking around and see if you have boundaries, or good boundaries, or bad boundaries, or any boundaries. And then subscribe, like, and tune back in, and let's talk more in future posts like this one about how to create good boundaries and what those good boundaries would look like for you. Again, I'm Brett, licensed psychotherapist, and thanks. Thanks for letting me share a little bit of clinical advice about boundaries, setting healthy boundaries in your relationship. All right, take care.